Hi. In this example, what I want to do is I've got some code that's working that's fairly complex. Complex in the sense that it's doing some parsing of a base 64 image. It's then checking for a bucket on AWS, and it's uploading an image. And this is where my code is doing this. I'm setting this up as a method on a SQLized object. And there's a couple of things here that I think are worth looking at before. What I want to do is really go in and refactor this code a bit because this is fairly complex, what's going on here, and really separate it out to make the code more maintainable and more testable, which is, I think, something that's important. And the other thing that I want to do is that when I test it, I don't really want to go and hit AWS with every test. I really would like to, stub things out. We could always have an AWS integration test, but for my model test, I want to try to avoid this. So just looking at this code, what this is basically doing is that this is returning a new promise. And one of the reasons why I'm returning a new promise is that there's some parsing that's being done, and the parsing in itself is not asynchronous, but I want whoever uses this code to be able to use it as a promise. So that if they end up calling this upload function, I want them to be able to get a promise back which will either succeed or will fail, and they could end up catching that error. We'll see that when we end up testing it. So this is one of the reasons why I'm wrapping this in a new promise. And so there's really three parts to this. There's taking this image, which is a base 64 encoded image, and it also gets passed in a bucket name for AWS. And I'm doing some parsing where I'm basically taking this data that ends up getting passed in here and I'm parsing it out. And what I'm going to end up getting back is an extension, which matches the first part of this regex match over here. And the second part of this, which is going to be the body, which I'm then turning into a buffer. And I'm doing this because AWS expects to get a buffer. After doing that, calling S3, which is a, could actually take a look at this. I'm not really even going to use this for the tests. But this S3 is basically just using the AWS SDK and using some configuration values that I've set up that I'm not going to be showing here. So in this case, going in and I'm really testing that I'm able to create this bucket. This AWS SDK has a promise method, so it basically permissifies this create bucket. So once I make it down here, I know I'm able to create the bucket, and I'm going to attempt to put this object onto AWS. And what AWS basically needs is a bucket name, some permissions, so I'll be able to see the images. The body, which is this, has to go in the form of a buffer. It also needs to have a key, and it also needs to have an extension. Once this is successful, I'm going to set up my URL, which is, again, a little bit simplistic, but I'm setting up my URL so I could access the image, which is going to be on S3, Amazon AWS, with the bucket name and the key, and I'm saving it. And in fact, if I was to go over here and run these tests, which I'm running now, one of the problems is that it is actually calling AWS and it can end up timing out. So now it's actually not timing out, it's working, but it literally is going in and calling AWS every time that I end up running this test, which means that, let me open this up in Chrome just so you could see it. But here's the image that's really getting uploaded as part of my test, which is not going to be the greatest thing because I'm really going to be uploading this image every time. So what I want to do is eventually stub these methods out and clean this up. So the way that I'm going to end up doing this is I'm going to take this code, which is, fairly complex, and break it down into two different parts. And then we're going to add a third part later on that's going to allow us to do some image resizing. But the first two parts that I want to do is I'm going to have one method, a utility method, that's going to end up parsing out my image to pull out to give me back a buffer and extension. And the second part is going to end up uploading it to AWS. And I'm going to stub both those things out so I could end up testing them. So that's the next part of what I'll end up doing. The first thing that I'm going to do is get this to fail. The way that I'm going to get this to fail is in a very simple way. I'm going to create a bucket that I know already exists on AWS. I didn't create it. It's not under my permissions, in which case if I attempt to upload to an AWS bucket, which is called bucket, I'll get an error that that bucket name is not available. And again, I'm hitting AWS. This is something that I want to avoid. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, break this up a little bit. And what I'm going to end up doing is, let's actually have, I'm going to create a file, and I'm going to call this image utils. In this image utils, I'm going to actually have two methods here. I'm going to have a parse method, which just takes some data. This is going to end up returning a extension and a buffer. And I'm going to have another method, which is to AWS. It's going to take a number of different things. So what does AWS need? For AWS, I'm going to need to pass in a buffer, an extension. I'm also going to have to pass in a key and also a bucket name. And I'm literally going to go and create these methods by going in here. And I'm going to copy and paste some of this stuff and work my way out of it. So here, this is going to be my regex, which is going to be my data that ends up getting passed in here. I'm going to take this out. And so if this ends up basically throwing exception, I'll handle it within the calling code. But here I've got my extension, and here I've got my, I don't need my key here. This is going to be my buffer. And I'm going to end up passing back my extension and my buffer. And let's actually get this thing to pass again so we can see it working. So we'll go back to com.erickatz.bucket. And now we're back to passing. Let's get it to actually pass the test. We're calling this a bucket. And this ends up passing. Again, right now we're still uploading this to AWS. Let's go and sort of back out of this a little bit at a time. So we're going to bring in our image utils, which is going to be require /image utils. And so instead of actually putting all this code here, I'm going to say let extension buffer, and I'm going to put a try and a catch over here. So what we're going to try to do here when we go in here, instead of doing the work in here, let's say result, and this is going to be image utils, and we're going to say we want to parse. Here's the data that we're passing in here, and we'll go over here and we'll say extension equals result dot extension, and we'll say buffer equals result dot buffer, and we'll go over here and we're going to take this out here. We've already got our extension. Our buffer is simply going to be the buffer that we end up getting back. And if we go to run this, we should see now that we've taken a little bit of this work out. We're still parsing it. We're still sending it up to AWS, but at least we're separating it out a little bit. And we'll see we're getting a base 64 error here. Let's take a look and see where that's coming from. And of course, if we look at our image utils, we'll find out module.exports, and we're going to return parse. So this should hopefully end up passing. So this ends up getting uploaded. This ends up passing. We've got our parse method. We're doing our work here. If there's an error here, we end up catching it. We end up dealing with it. And again, who's ever using this is going to end up using this as a promise, which we want. So that's the first part of this. So the second part of this is now we really want to take this code here, which is uploading things to AWS. So let's take this code here. Let's go back to our image utils. And we're going to return this promise. We're going to end up passing in here a bucket name. We're going to pass in a key. So this is now going to be key. Body is going to be the buffer that ended up getting passed in. Let's move this back a little bit, make it a little bit nicer to read. And we'll say to AWS here. And instead of going in here and doing all this here, we're going to say image utils to AWS. What are we passing in there? We're passing in our buffer. We're passing in our extension. We're passing in our key. We're passing in our bucket name. And here we've got this error that S3 is not defined, and that's true. So let's go over here. So S3 is literally, since this is in the same folder, we could copy that in. Now we've got S3 here. And again, we're timing out here because we're running, and we could also increase the time as well. But we're timing out just because, again, it's taking us a little bit of while to go up to AWS. When we end up stubbing this out, this will end up going away. So we can also just clean up one thing here. Right now, we don't need our S3 inside of our image. This should not end up changing anything. And all we've really succeeded in doing here was to really move some of our code out. So the majority of our work here, both our parsing and our moving up to AWS, are in a separate file. So the next thing that we're going to end up doing is that let's modify our test so that instead of actually going and calling AWS, which can take a while, it's, taking different times really here, and instead of actually using resources and uploading to AWS, we'll end up stubbing these things out. So we're going to do a little bit of a happy path here. In fact, I'm going to just run this test for the moment. Again, we're timing out. We'll end up fixing that in a bit. So what I want to do here is that I'm going to use a library called sign-on. I have it installed here, so I don't need to install it. But if not, we should probably install it. I mean, it might be for each. I'm going to stub out those two methods that I ended up refactoring. So I'm going to put a let in here, and this is going to be for parse, and this is going to be for AWS. And both of these are going to be stubs, so I'm going to be able to do an after each. And you always want to do this if you're stubbing something out, that if you're stubbing, you're going to want to unstub, and you're going to want to restore this functionality. Again, right now we don't really have stubs, so this would end up breaking because there's really nothing to restore. But let's actually set these up. So we're going to start off with parse. And how we're going to do this, we're going to say sign on. We want you to stub image utils parse. And what's to AWS? We want to stub to AWS. And also, let's actually bring in, so we have it. And we've got to go up a couple of levels here. Server DB, image utils. That should allow us to either stub and go and unstub. And the problem is now is that we're stubbing, but we're not doing anything with this data. That's where we're getting this error. So the first thing that we'll end up doing here is that let's go and stub our parse method. Our parse method is going to end up returning something. And let's do something here to say, hey, look, parse, if you're called with args, and the args that we'll end up calling you with is, let's just pretend, we're not even going to use real data here because we don't have to. Right now we're actually using a string of base 64 encoded string to do this. We're going to avoid that. And we're going to say, hey, look, parse, if you're called with the args ABC, we're going to tell you to return, and this just ends up returning an object, right? We actually have this within a promise chain, but we're going to say, hey, your extension, we can make this up to whatever we want it to be as extension, and your buffer, we're basically going to transform this ABC into a buffer that we're calling DEF. And let's also look and think about what 2 AWS is going to end up doing. So for 2 AWS, we'll say that for 2 AWS, when you come in with args, and the way that this is going to work, we don't have to put all the arguments in it, but as long as if it matches the first few args, this will end up working. And again, our deal here is that we don't want to end up hitting AWS. So we'll say, hey, look, we ended up parsing you out. If we look at how this ends up getting called, it ends up getting passed in a buffer. This buffer was created by parsing, so we end up coming in with DEF. Our extension is going to be JPEG. And we'll say, we can really just worry about these two. And we'll say when this ends up happening, this is going to be returning. And here, this has to return a promise. So we'll say promise resolve. Hey, look, this was successful in going up to AWS, and it shouldn't end up hitting AWS. So let's take a look and see what happens here. So we're still getting our base 64 error here. And of course, that's happening because we're actually not stubbing with the right value. We don't even need smiley. So we'll take smiley out, and we'll fake this out. Again, we just want to test out that this calls the right methods. We don't actually need it to parse anything. We could test out parse separately as a unit test. So when parse ends up coming in with ABC, because this is what ends up getting parsed, we should at least see this error message go away, and we're getting a different message here. And let's really make sure that we're not hitting AWS by modifying this and saying, hey, look, this is going to be bucket. We know we can't create a bucket called bucket because that already exists. And if this is the case, what do we expect to get back here? Our image URL is going to be bucket. And we'll end up coming in here. And this is going to end up coming in with our extension of JPEG. Again, we could call it whatever we want to. Let's just make sure that 2 AWS returns this. So here, we're basically stubbing out our two methods. And again, we could test, we're stubbing these out because we just want to see that, hey, look, this method gets called with these values. If it returns this, this method is going to get called with these values. And again, it doesn't, there could be other values after this, and there will be because we're passing in a key and a bucket name. But this will be enough to end up basically catching this and basically saying, hey, look, you're good. You ended up resolving up to AWS, when in fact, we didn't end up resolving up to AWS. And let's just make sure that we could end up getting this to work. And of course, if I'm changing this to be PNG, then this needs to end up getting called with PNG. And this ends up passing. And notice it's running relatively fast. If I go to attempt to find this image, I'm not going to find it because it didn't actually upload to AWS, which is good because I didn't really want it to upload to AWS. And so now I've gone in and I've been able to stub out both these methods. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is I want to take a look, and we could also go in here just to get this one to pass as well. And if we end up doing this, we want to see that this fails for the right reasons. Not sure it's catching that. So this ends up throwing, but let's actually test it out a little bit of a different way here. Let's just go in here, do sort of the same thing we had here. So here we want to test out an invalid image. So instead of our parse, what we're going to do with this parse, when we come in here with AWS, let's just say throws, and what should happen if this throws, I really shouldn't even end up making it down here. I'm going to take this out. It's really only parse that I'm testing out here. So assuming this ended up coming in with bad data, that'll end up passing. Let's just get it to fail to see that it's working. Call it base 6 error, and it's a base 64 error. So both these things, I'm really stubbing these out to test these. Here I'm able to go and stub out the image utils method, and again, I restore it afterwards. The stub method. It'll end up coming in with this. I'll end up, throwing a new error. Okay, so let's actually go and do one other thing here. So right now we're taking this image and we are basically parsing it and we're uploading it to AWS. Let's use another library, and we're going to use that library to do some resizing of our image. So we'll end up adding that in, and after we add that in, we'll end up writing a test to end up stubbing it out. I'm going to cheat a little bit here. I actually have a method here for doing resizing, and I'm going to end up needing a library, and this is a library that is commonly used to do image manipulation. And so this library is Graphics Magic, and you could read the history. There's I think Graphics Magic was basically, Image Magic was the first one, and Graphics Magic was forked from it, but still, Image Magic is what is often ends up getting used to do the image manipulation. Again, I'm not an expert on it. You could read up on it if you'd like, but what I'm going to end up doing here is I'm going to create a resize method. And these methods, unfortunately, are not permissified. So I'll just show you the logic here really quick. So the way that this works is that, and again, there's any number of ways you could end up calling this, but since these end up taking callbacks, I'm really permissifying it. And what this ends up taking in is a buffer that comes in. So basically this collection of bytes, it's got to know what the extension is, because what it's going to end up doing is it's going to go and it can do all kinds of things, whether it's cropping or coloring or special effects. Real simply, we're going to take this buffer, which has this data. We're going to end up resizing it. And so what I'm saying here is, hey, look, keep whatever aspect ratio it has, but make the height 50. Okay, again, there's a billion different things you could end up doing this. And I'm going to turn it back into a buffer because what I need to send up to AWS is a buffer. So I specify, hey, look, I want to send it out to a buffer, and I need to specify what extension it's supposed to be so it knows how to output it to this buffer. And this could end up turning into a problem. So if there's an error, I'm going to end up rejecting this promise. Otherwise, I'm going to end up resolving this promise. And we'll go over here and we'll call resize. And I'm going to go back to my image file. And instead of starting with image to AWS, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say image utils. And I'm going to end up resizing. And what am I going to end up resizing? I'm going to end up resizing. Again, it needs a buffer and an extension. And I'll get a then here. And this is going to give me back the new resize buffer. And just to make my life a little bit easier here, I'm going to put this on one line. Move this back here. And we can move all of these over. So it's going to end up resizing first. And let's just take a look and see what that does to the test. This is the problem because I'm attempting to resize something, but I don't have the appropriate data to do it. So the same way that I ended up doing my test here, I'm going to specify resize just to keep these in order. This is going to be resize, and this is going to be image utils resize. And so what's going to happen is that resize is going to end up getting fed this data. So I'll say resize with args. Hey, look, when you end up getting pumped in this data, which is going to be DEF and PNG, I'm going to return to you. And again, this is going to be a promise. So I'll say this is going to get EF, DEF, and I'm just going to say that this is going to end up resolving. Again, this is resizing to another buffer. And I'll just say that this is going to end up getting sent back with resize. So what should end up happening here is I'm going to end up parsing. I'm going to end up getting resized. And so the only change here is that this should end up getting called with resized, right? First, I parse, then I resize. Resize ends up getting called with whatever ended up coming back from parse. It ends up returning a promise with resize, so I expect AWS to get resized. It ends up resolving, and let's also do this in order. Resize, restore, because that's basically a stub. And that should end up passing as well. So just to sort of see this in action, is that this is actually part of a web application here. And if I go to start it, and I go and grab an image here, and I take an image, no matter how big the image is. So we'll take this image over here, and we'll see that it ends up getting resized to 50 pixels. Let's just see if we could find something else just to really prove that. A lot of these images are too big. Let's try this one. And this ends up getting resized as well. So the big takeaway here is to take something that is fairly complex and setting it up so that you could end up really breaking it apart. And again, you don't necessarily have to, you don't necessarily have to run all this code. You could end up testing out all these methods individually. You could have an integration test that actually tests them as well. But the whole idea here is that you have the ability to stub things out. We really don't want to interact with a third party for what would be considered a unit test. And we really stub out the 3 parts of this unit test.